was barely breaking over the desert bastion, washing the sky above the eastern horizon in pale, dusty hues of pink and gray. The air hung still and dry, carrying a fine suspension of sand that settled as a thin film on everything. The sun, still hidden behind the jagged line of distant cliffs, had yet to bring the scorching heat of day, but its promise already hung heavy in the motionless atmosphere. The bastion walls, a chaotic yet seemingly sturdy weave of rusted steel sheets, cracked concrete blocks, and crudely hewn stones, cast long, distorted shadows onto the packed earth within the perimeter. The settlement stirred slowly, reluctantly, from slumber. The farmers were the first to emerge, a few stooped figures in faded clothing heading toward their tiny, meticulously fenced plots of land near the southern wall. There, on patches of soil painstakingly reclaimed from the desert and enriched with meager organic scraps, they cultivated tough, hardy grains and root vegetables, the staples of the bastion's diet. The rusty hinges of workshop doors creaked open. The blacksmith, a man with powerful arms and a soot-streaked face, was already stoking the forge fire, preparing to transform useless metal scraps scavenged from beyond the walls into crude but essential tools, knives or arrowheads. Seamstresses in their cramped rooms laid out worn pieces of fabric, ready to patch the settler's clothing yet again, stretching its lifespan to the absolute limit. Life here was defined by scarcity. Water, drawn from a deep well and painstakingly purified, was rationed strictly. Every drop counted. Food, especially protein, was incredibly valuable, a currency for barter and a measure of wealth. The very air they breathed constantly scratched the throat with dust. Ali was already on the walls, making his customary morning rounds. His steps were measured, unhurried, but his gaze was sharp, observant. His face, weathered and etched with a fine network of wrinkles around the eyes, held an expression of perpetual concentration. He checked the sentry posts, giving short nods to the men peering out into the gray pre-dawn wasteland. He rapped his knuckles against shaky sections of the railing, inspected the condition of the masonry at the base of the wall, mentally noting areas that needed repair. He wasn't merely the head of security. He felt the weight of responsibility for every one of the hundreds of lives sheltered behind these walls. The feeling was almost a physical pressure on his shoulders, a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. Beneath his coarse shirt, hanging from a worn leather cord, was a metal locket, yellowed with age. Inside, beneath clouded plastic, lay a tiny photograph. A young man in the uniform of an old-world Marine holding a small boy. His great-grandfather. This locket was more than just a memento of an ancestor or a symbol of a lost order. For Ali, it was the tangible embodiment of duty, a link across time, a reminder of what had to be protected, even when hope felt all but lost. Before ascending the walls, he had spent a few minutes at home. His dwelling, like most, was small, built of stone and clay, with narrow slit-like windows resembling arrow loops. His wife, Zara, silently placed a meager breakfast on the table. Flatbreads made from coarse flour and a bowl of some thin vegetable gruel. Her face was tired, but her movements held a familiar tenderness. Their children, a boy of about 10, already trying to mimic his father's seriousness, and a girl of 7, whose eyes seemed too large for her thin face, played quietly on the earthen floor with homemade toys of wood and rags. Ali touched his wife's cheek, their eyes meeting for a moment, a glance filled with affection, unspoken understanding, and a shared weariness from the struggle to survive. Zara murmured that the flower supplies were running low, and that their youngest daughter had started coughing again at night. The dust got everywhere. These simple words only intensified Ali's sense of responsibility. He wasn't fighting for abstract ideals, but for these specific people, for their future, however bleak it seemed in this merciless world. Back on the wall, he continued his rounds. The morning sun finally crested the cliffs, bathing the wasteland in harsh, unforgiving light. A few miles to the west, Ali spotted movement. A pack of feral, mutated creatures, vaguely dog-like but larger, with patchy fur and disproportionately large jaws, was chasing some small, fast-moving mutant resembling a grotesque lizard. Such scenes were common sights in the wasteland. The brutal struggle for existence in its purest form. But they served as a constant reminder of the dangers lurking beyond the fragile protection of the walls. The sentries in that section watched the chase idly. Ali moved closer, his voice quiet but firm, snapping them to attention, urging them to scan the distance more carefully. Relaxation was a luxury they couldn't afford, not even for a second. Later, as the sun began its descent toward the west, painting the sky in crimson tones, Ali, citing the need to check the condition of an old signal post on the far perimeter, went out the main gates alone. The heavy metal leaf scraped shut behind him, sealing him off from the relative safety of the bastion. He moved northwest, his steps quick and silent. He kept to open ground, constantly scanning his surroundings, listening for the slightest sound. The sense of vulnerability out here was almost palpable. After a couple of miles, he reached the designated meeting place, the rusted, half-buried chassis of an old automobile, a relic from before the Great Fire. Tension coiled tighter with every passing minute of waiting. A figure emerged from behind a nearby cluster of rocks. Gleave. His appearance was repellent. Gray skin, peeling in patches, stretched taut over bone. His eyes were clouded, the whites nearly gone. But unlike most of his kind, a flicker of awareness remained within them. It was this flicker Ali had noticed during their first encounter months ago. He moved stiffly, but not with the chaotic aimlessness of common zombies. He was dressed in tattered rags that might once have been clothing. Ali silently held out a heavy tin can of preserved meat, a precious resource in the bastion, and a flask of clean water. Gleave snatched them greedily, yet ate almost humanly, not scattering the food, carefully bringing the can to his mouth. Ali waited. Finally, Gleave spoke. His speech was labored, guttural, the words formed with visible effort, but they were intelligible. He reported seeing unusual activity in the wasteland north of their position. Not just wandering groups of mutants or feral packs, but something else. Something organized. He repeated the name Alpha several times, a name he'd overheard from other mutants, those possessing remnants of intellect. He spoke of a large gathering unprecedented in scale. Gleave looked frightened, as much as a creature of his kind could. He said it didn't feel like the usual raids for plunder. "Big trouble coming," he rasped, stronger than before. Ali felt an icy chill spread through him despite the warm evening air. Gleave's warning sounded too serious to ignore. Ali didn't linger. Under the cover of the rapidly gathering dusk, he returned to the bastion with the same swift, silent stride. The guards at the gate, recognizing his silhouette, hastily opened the heavy leaf just enough for him to slip inside. Bypassing his home, he headed straight for the central building, a fortified structure of concrete and steel that housed the settlement's administration and the mayor's quarters. He demanded an immediate meeting with Gret. His usually calm face was tense, a detail not lost on the mayor's aides. Gret was found in his modest office, lit by a dim electric bulb powered by a generator. He was an elderly man, his face deeply lined, his gray hair cropped short. He had survived much: raider attacks, several sieges by mutant hordes, hungry winters and epidemics. His pragmatism and measured decisions had helped the bastion endure where other settlements had fallen. He listened to Ali's report intently, without interruption, his gaze shrewd. He respected Ali and knew the man wouldn't raise alarm over nothing. Gret also remembered previous instances where information from the strange sentient zombie named Gleave had proven valuable, albeit fragmented. However, the notion that different types of mutants, zombies, hybrids, perhaps even the elusive werewolves, could unite under a single command seemed almost incredible. It contradicted all their years of observing the wasteland's inhabitants, who typically fought each other as fiercely as they fought humans. Skepticism flickered in his eyes, but he didn't dismiss the warning outright. The news, still speculative, inevitably leaked to the tight circle of the mayor's closest advisors and senior militia officers, whom Gret convened after Ali left. The reaction was mixed. Some were openly terrified, imagining a mutant horde storming the walls. Others treated the report with disbelief, dismissing it as exaggerated rumors or the delusions of a half-decayed zombie. Arguments erupted. Should they expend precious, limited resources, fuel, ammunition, fortification materials, manpower, preparing for a hypothetical attack of unprecedented scale? Wouldn't it be better to focus on current problems? Food shortages, repairing the water pump? Ali, summoned back by Gret to participate in the discussion, had to firmly defend his position. He cited Gleave's proven reliability as a source in the past, his own experienced guard's intuition sensing a change in the wasteland's behavior over recent weeks. He insisted that ignoring such a threat was an unaffordable luxury. Ultimately, Gret made a compromise. Before declaring a full-scale mobilization, they needed confirmation. Ali received permission to dispatch a small but well-armed and experienced reconnaissance team, 4 fighters he trusted, in the direction Gleave had indicated to the north. Their mission was clear: avoid all contact, operate with maximum stealth, confirm or deny the presence of a large mutant gathering, and, if possible without undue risk, try to estimate its approximate size and composition. The team departed the following night, melting into the darkness beyond the bastion gates. For Ali and Gret, long hours of tense waiting began. The settlement carried on its usual routines, but a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. The scouts returned 2 days later at dawn. They were exhausted, their clothes torn, one man wounded. A deep, ragged gash on his shoulder from the claws of some unknown creature. They hadn't seen the horde itself, but what they discovered left no doubt about the gravity of the threat. They had stumbled upon the tracks of its recent passage. Vast stretches of dry steppe grass were trampled flat by thousands of feet. They saw the remains of wild animals, torn apart with incredible savagery. They found the corpses of other, weaker mutants, evidently swept aside by this force. But the most horrifying discovery awaited them at the ruins of a small nomadic settlement, known to exist about 30 miles north. All its inhabitants had been slaughtered. The scouts struggled for words describing the scene. It wasn't the usual massacre by starving mutants. The bodies were mutilated methodically, with a chilling organization that was more terrifying than simple brutality. It bore the hallmarks of an intelligent, ruthless enemy. Allie met Gleave again at the same spot, bringing more food and water in exchange for details. Anxiety and perhaps the extra rations loosened the mutant's tongue. He began sharing fragmented, terrifying memories surfacing in his damaged brain. Memories of the Great Fire. That was the name given to the series of global conflicts that began 2 centuries ago with trade wars and regional clashes, US and China, the Middle East, India and Pakistan, Ukraine and Russia, escalating rapidly into a worldwide catastrophe involving nuclear and dirty weapons deployed by Iran, North Korea, China, the US, and others. Much of the planet had turned into radioactive wasteland. Humanity survived only in a few isolated clean zones and enclaves like the Bastion. Over 200 years, radiation and possibly biological weapons had spawned nightmarish creatures. Gleave described the chaos of the first days after the bombings, the panic, the screams, the fires. He'd seen people change, turning into mindless, flesh-eating zombies driven only by hunger. He'd witnessed the emergence of beast-like hybrids, monstrous fusions of different creatures. Grotesque Siamese mutants fused from multiple human bodies. And the most dangerous, the werewolves, who retained their intellect but gained incredible strength, cunning, and animalistic fury. Most mutants could think and even speak a little, but followed primitive instincts, were aggressive and prone to madness. All except the werewolves, whose cunning made them especially dangerous. Gleave himself had become a zombie, but some anomaly allowed him to retain part of his former self, fragments of memory, and the ability for coherent speech. He confirmed Allie's worst fears. Alpha was a werewolf, and he was subjugating other mutants, even hostile species, through brute force and primal fear. Putting together all the data, Gleave's words, the chilling report from the recon team, historical observations of mutant behavior, Allie and Gret no longer doubted. The threat was real, unprecedented. Alpha had somehow broken or bypassed the interspecies hostility, creating an army from vastly different creatures. He likely used the more intelligent werewolves as commanders, with zombies and hybrids as expendable fodder, the first wave. This demanded immediate, decisive action. Mayor Gret gave the order. The Bastion was to enter a state of siege. Total mobilization of all available resources and personnel to prepare for defense. The skeptics fell silent in the face of the horrifying evidence. Tension gripped the settlement. Fear became almost palpable, but alongside it grew a grim determination to defend their home to the last. Life in the Bastion changed overnight. Mayor Gret's order for siege footing and total mobilization jerked the settlement from its monotonous rhythm of survival into feverish activity. All efforts focused on preparing for the seemingly inevitable attack. Farmers hastily harvested the last of the meager crops from their plots, knowing that soon venturing beyond the inner fences would be impossible. The gathered grain and vegetables were meticulously counted and stored in the central repository under strict control. Artisans shifted entirely to defense needs. The blacksmith and his apprentices worked day and night, their hammers ringing rhythmically against metal, reforging old tools, rebar segments, and other scrap into spear and arrowheads, simple swords, and knives. They repaired the few existing crossbows, patched punctured shields made of sheet metal. Seamstresses put aside tailoring and mending clothes. Now they reinforced leather components of homemade armor, sewed bags for sand and earth. Even women not engaged in crafts, the elderly, and adolescents were drawn into the communal effort. They carried stones and earth to reinforce the walls, helped mix mortar for masonry, prepared reserves of drinking water in large containers, and made bandages. The air crackled with tension, a mixture of fear of the unknown threat and a somber unity in the face of shared danger. People worked silently, focused, their faces grim. Ali personally oversaw the fortification of the defensive perimeter. Under his watchful eye, old cracks and breaches discovered during his rounds were filled. The most vulnerable sections were built up, using anything that could serve as construction material. Concrete fragments from old ruined structures found in the wasteland, rusted metal sheets, stones of various sizes, bags tightly packed with sand and tamped earth. Special attention was paid to the main gates, massive, yet still the most obvious weak point in the defenses. They were reinforced with additional steel plates and thick wooden beams on the inside. Just behind the gates, in a small square, a second line of defense began to rise. Several sturdy barricades of stones, sandbags, and overturned carts, designed to create a narrow choke point and hold back the enemy should the main barrier fall. Simultaneously, another group, led by experienced hunters, worked outside the bastion, along the likely paths of the mutant horde's approach. They dug deep wolf pits, camouflaged traps covered with branches and a thin layer of earth. The bottom of each pit bristled with sharpened wooden stakes or rebar spikes. Their purpose wasn't so much to kill as to wound, slow, and disorient the attackers, especially the mindless zombies in the front ranks. In narrow passages between rock outcroppings and on open ground before the walls, primitive warning systems were set up. Tripwires of thin wire or rope strung with empty tin cans, metal scraps, and other rattling debris. Their goal: create noise, alert the defenders to the enemy's approach, and sow confusion among the attacking zombies. Limited supplies of barbed wire, salvaged long ago from the ruins of an old military base and carefully preserved, were unrolled and secured as low entanglements in the most probable breach points. In parallel, an inventory and preparation of all available weaponry took place. The few old rifles and pistols, miraculously preserved and maintained, were meticulously cleaned and checked. Ammunition was critically low, each bullet worth its weight in gold. Blacksmiths tirelessly forged simple but effective arrowheads and spear points. Woodworkers repaired bows and crossbows, crafted new spear shafts. Large stockpiles of stones sized for throwing from the walls were created, a simple but effective deterrent against a crowd at the base of the fortifications. Women, under Ali and Gret's guidance, prepared incendiary mixtures in glass bottles, so-called Molotov cocktails. Fuel was scarce, so any available flammable liquid was used. Remnants of gasoline, technical oils mixed with thickeners. Ali organized the defenders. All able-bodied men, including the militia, ordinary settlers with only basic weapon skills and minimal training, were assigned to defense sectors along the entire wall perimeter. Section commanders, the most experienced fighters, were appointed. The best marksmen skilled with firearms or crossbows took positions on the few watchtowers and fortified wall sections. They were given strict orders: conserve ammunition, shoot only to kill, aiming for the most dangerous identifiable enemies: werewolves or large, aggressive hybrids. Small mobile teams of the most capable fighters, armed with melee weapons and spears, were formed. Their task was to move quickly along the walls to repel breach attempts, launch counterattacks, and extinguish potential fires. Ali and Gret, hunched over a crudely drawn map of the bastion and its surroundings, developed a detailed defense plan. The primary strategy was to maximally exhaust the first wave of attackers, expected, according to Gleave, to consist mainly of zombies. The plan was to stop or slow them with traps, volleys of stones, arrows, and sparse gunfire, preventing them from massing at the walls in large numbers to begin an assault. At the critical moment, when pressure on the walls became unbearable, they planned to deploy a firewall, igniting combustible materials, oil-soaked branches, old rags, tires, piled beforehand at the base of the walls. They also decided to use Gleave's information about the weaknesses of various mutant types, attempting to distract zombies with loud noises, banging on metal sheets, and concentrating Molotov cocktails against those hybrids rumored to fear fire. The plan was thorough, but everyone understood that actual combat could impose its own brutal adjustments. Preparations continued relentlessly. Time was running out. The final days before the estimated date of the attack, calculated based on the Horde's movement speed reported by the scouts, passed in oppressive silence and tense anticipation. The work of fortifying the walls and preparing supplies was mostly complete. Now came the final checks. Fighters on the walls arranged their weapons within easy reach: quivers of arrows, piles of stones, spears, water flasks, and meager rations. Medics, if the healers and few settlers with basic first aid training could be called that, set up dressing stations in the most protected areas behind the walls, laying out their scant supplies of bandages made from old cloth and disinfecting herbal tinctures. The silence that settled over the bastion after the feverish activity of the preceding days felt unnatural, suffocating. Every random sound, the creak of planks, the distant cry of a night bird beyond the walls, even one's own breath, made people jump and look around anxiously. The wasteland outside seemed frozen, as if holding its breath before the storm. Ali found a few precious minutes to go home. The atmosphere there was heavy. Zara sat silently by the hearth, holding the children close. The boy tried to look brave, but his eyes betrayed his fear. The little girl clung to her mother, sobbing quietly from time to time. Ali knelt beside them on the earthen floor. He tried to soothe them, spoke softly, promising he would do everything to protect them, that he would definitely return. The words sounded unconvincing even to himself. Zara looked up, her eyes filled with terror, but she managed a weak smile and nodded. He double-checked the heavy bolt on the door, left Zara the sharp knife she hid beneath her clothes. Saying goodbye, he held the children tightly, then his wife. As he left the house, he pulled his great-grandfather's locket out from under his shirt. The metal felt cold. He didn't tuck it back in, but slung the cord over his makeshift protective jacket of thick leather reinforced with metal plates. Now it wasn't just a symbol of memory, but a talisman, a last hope for protection in the coming hell. The night before the expected attack arrived, the bastion plunged into darkness, lit only by sparse torches on the walls, and if the sky was clear, the eerie glow of the full moon. Moonlight bathed the surroundings in a silvery sheen, creating bizarre, deceptive shadows where imagination painted moving figures. The settlement held its breath. Most residents huddled in their homes behind barricaded doors, listening to the night sounds. On the walls, sentries strained their eyes, peering into the darkness, nerves stretched taut. False alarms punctuated the night. A flock of night birds startling into flight nearby, a long, chilling howl of some mutated beast echoing in the distance. But not the sound they were waiting for. Each time the defenders' hearts would stop, then slowly resume their anxious rhythm. In the dead of night, when the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. At the base of the wall in the prearranged sector, using the deep shadows, Gleave appeared. He approached perilously close, risking detection not only by sentries but also by potential mutant scouts, especially werewolves, who, as he'd said, despised and hated zombies, even ones like him. He called softly for Ali. Ali quickly descended the inner ladder and approached a narrow slit near the wall's base. Gleave relayed the last, most crucial piece of information. The horde was immense, far larger than they'd estimated from the tracks. Alpha was leading them personally. The first wave would be mostly zombies, thrown forward to test the defenses, force the defenders to expend ammunition and energy, fill the traps with their bodies. The main force, hybrids and werewolves, would follow once the defense weakened. Gleave looked, if the word applied to him, more haggard and frightened than ever before. He rasped a final warning to Ali, advising extreme caution, then vanished as silently as he'd appeared into the darkness. In the final hours before dawn, quiet sounds drifted through the settlement. Muffled prayers could be heard, people appealing to long-forgotten gods or simply whispering words of hope. Old men muttered curses against fate and the mutants. Some fighters on the walls checked their weapons again and again, drawing bowstrings, testing crossbow mechanisms, counting precious few cartridges. Others simply squatted, backs against the cold stone of the wall, staring into the void before them, their faces impassive masks. The atmosphere thickened, becoming almost viscous with fear. Yet within that fear lay the grim resolve of people with nowhere left to run. Mayor Gret, despite his age, joined Ali on the walls. They slowly walked the posts, Gret offering a few words of encouragement to each fighter. He didn't speak of glory or heroism. His address, delivered to small groups of defenders, was short, pragmatic, and powerful. He spoke of survival, of the bastion being their only home in this hostile world, that there was no retreat. Behind them were their families, their children. He said they must fight for the future, whatever it might be, for every patch of this earth, for every life within these walls. His calm, steady voice, devoid of pathos, had a slightly calming effect, restoring some measure of fortitude. About an hour before dawn, as the eastern sky began to pale, lookouts on the western wall were the first to catch it. A distant but steadily growing noise. A low, vibrating rumble mixed with the shuffling of thousands of feet on dry earth, punctuated by inhuman moans, rasps, and sharp howls. The sound grew louder, closer, and then, in the gray pre-dawn haze, it appeared on the horizon. A dark, undulating mass, hundreds of yards wide, moving slowly but inexorably toward the bastion. The siege had begun. As the first true rays of sun pierced the morning haze, the mutant horde revealed itself to the defenders of the bastion in all its nightmarish grandeur. It was a sight to freeze the blood in the veins of even the most hardened fighters. An innumerable mass of zombies, creatures in varying states of decay, from nearly fresh corpses to skeletal figures draped in remnants of skin, shambled forward, an inexorable tide. Some still wore the tattered clothing of the old world, adding a grotesque layer to the scene. They moved slowly, shuffling, stumbling, falling, only to rise again and continue their relentless advance toward the walls, drawn by insatiable hunger or some unknown will directing them. There were so many, it seemed the very earth itself was stirring. Behind this first wave, larger, faster figures were visible, bestial hybrids moving in lurching bursts, staying low to the ground. And further back, several hundred yards distant, the dark, tall silhouettes of werewolves could be discerned. They appeared not to be charging, but observing and coordinating the movement of this monstrous army. The air filled with a low, guttural roar, the moans and rasps of thousands of throats. The front ranks of zombies reached the trap zone. Piercing, though perhaps painless in the human sense, shrieks and furious snarls erupted as the undead began tumbling into the camouflaged pits. Bodies hit the sharpened stakes with dull thuds. Others became entangled in the barbed wire, twitching uselessly, trying to break free. The tripwire alarms sprang into action, creating a deafening, chaotic cacophony that seemed to disorient some attackers, causing them to mill about. But there were too many zombies. They didn't stop. Those following simply shambled over the bodies of their fallen brethren, filling the pits until they ceased to be obstacles, crushing the barbed wire entanglements under the sheer weight of their numbers. The tide rolled relentlessly forward. Fire. Allie's voice cut sharply through the horde's roar for an instant. Archers and crossbowmen on the walls, awaiting the command, began loosing arrows and heavy bolts into the thick of the advance. Arrows sank into rotting flesh, bolts punched through skulls, but the effect was negligible against the scale of the horde. Marksmen with firearms took rare, carefully aimed shots. The crack of the old rifles sounded unnaturally loud amidst the din. Their targets weren't common zombies, but larger or stranger-looking mutants that might prove more dangerous. Ammunition conservation was paramount. Every shot had to count. Simultaneously, the stone throwers went into action. Hundreds of stones of varying sizes rained down from the walls, crashing onto the heads and shoulders of the zombies below. The sickening crack of breaking bone could be heard. Some zombies fell, only to be immediately replaced by others pressing forward. The battle devolved into a sensory nightmare. The deafening, ceaseless roar and moans of thousands of mutants merged into a single drone, pressing on the eardrums. Added to this were the sharp cries of wounded defenders, the whistle of arrows, the dull thud of stones hitting flesh or earth, the splintering of wood under the pressure of the mass. The air hung thick with the nauseating stench of decay, mixed with the acrid smell of fresh blood and dust. The sight of the endless mass of shambling, climbing, falling bodies was terrifying. Zombies reaching the walls began to claw their way up, grabbing onto stone ledges, using the bodies of those ahead as footholds. Their dead, empty eyes stared upward, bony hands with broken nails reaching for the defenders. It was a vision of pure primal horror embodied in rotting flesh. the main mass of zombies reached the base of the walls. They started clambering over each other, instinctively forming living, writhing pyramids to reach the top edge of the fortifications. Defenders met them with spears, long hooked poles, heavy stones and logs, trying to push them back down. Close quarters combat erupted on the walls. It was a desperate, bloody meat grinder. Defenders hacked and stabbed at reaching hands, smashed the heads of creatures that got too close. The zombies, devoid of pain, kept climbing, grabbing, biting. Several defenders, losing their balance or seized by a death grip, fell screaming into the churning mass below. Pressure on the central section of the wall, directly before the main gates, became critical. The living pyramids of zombie bodies nearly reached the top. "Fire wall, central sector, now," Ali roared. At his command, fighters in that section hurled Molotov cocktails down. Simultaneously, others used long torches to ignite the piles of oil-soaked branches, rags, and old tires stacked at the base of the wall. Fire roared upwards, engulfing the front ranks of zombies and the wall's base. The bright flames created a temporary but effective barrier. Even the undead instinctively recoiled from the fire. A new sound filled the air. The piercing, horrifying screams of burning mutants, flailing as they tried to beat out the flames, setting their brethren alight. The sickening stench of decay was joined by the repulsive odor of burning flesh. Despite the desperate resistance and the temporary success of the firewall, the bastion's defenders began taking their first serious losses. Besides the few unfortunates dragged from the walls, several more fighters suffered severe injuries from stones, bones, or metal shards hurled upwards by some of the stronger mutants. Medics in the shelters behind the walls struggled to keep up, bandaging wounds, staunching blood flow. Ali saw his people fall, witnessed their suffering. It only hardened his grim resolve. He gritted his teeth, tightened his grip on his heavy axe. The battle was just beginning. The first wave had been repulsed, but not destroyed, and the most dangerous enemies hadn't even entered the fray. Seeing that the first wave, composed primarily of mindless zombies, had failed to breach the bastion's defenses and had suffered significant losses from fire and the defenders' actions, Alpha, observing the battle from a safe distance, changed tactics. He committed the second wave, the hybrids. These creatures were nightmarish fusions of human and animal traits. Among them were beings with powerful clawed limbs, sharp fangs in deformed maws, covered in coarse bristles or scales, possessing incredible strength and agility for their size. They moved far faster and more purposefully than the zombies, easily leaping over the fallen and avoiding the most obvious traps. Their attacks weren't spread across the entire wall, but concentrated on specific sections where they perceived weakness or where defenders seemed fewer in number. Their snarls were fiercer, more aggressive than the zombies' mindless moans. Using their strength, speed, and sharp claws, which allowed them to cling to the smallest handholds on the wall, a group of particularly large and savage hybrids focused their assault on one of the side sections of the perimeter. Perhaps the fortifications there had been erected more hastily, or perhaps defender fatigue after repelling the first wave played a part. The hybrids scrambled up with astonishing speed, reaching the top of the wall. Several defenders attempting to stop them were instantly killed or thrown down by powerful swipes of clawed paws. A small beachhead formed on the wall, occupied by several furiously snarling beasts. a real threat of a breach into the settlement emerged. A fierce, chaotic struggle began for control of that narrow section of wall. Ali, constantly moving along the perimeter and monitoring the situation, immediately spotted the danger. "Reserve. With me," he yelled, and leading a small mobile squad of a dozen of the most experienced and well-armed fighters, he rushed to the threatened section. A furious battle erupted in the confined space. Ali, wielding his heavy axe, fought in the front ranks. He moved quickly, dodging claws and fangs, delivering powerful blows. Beside him, his men fought with the desperation of the doomed, using spears, swords, heavy clubs. The clang of metal, the snarls of hybrids, the cries of men merged into a single hideous sound. Ali managed to rally his fighters, and together they forced the hybrids off the wall, hurling them down. But the victory came at a steep price. 3 men from his squad were killed, several more seriously wounded. The section was held, but the reserve had taken losses, and the defenders' strength was dwindling. The battle had raged for hours without pause. The sun climbed high, its rays beating down mercilessly, adding to the suffering of the exhausted defenders. The bastion's resources were nearing depletion. Quivers were almost empty. Piles of throwing stones had shrunk noticeably. The flammable mixtures for Molotov cocktails were practically gone, used up repelling the first attack and containing the breach. Only a handful of firearm cartridges remained, saved for the direst emergency. The defenders were physically exhausted, the sleepless night of waiting and hours of continuous combat taking their toll. But the moral exhaustion was even greater. For many, the initial determination was giving way to fatigue, fear, and encroaching despair at the sight of the seemingly endless waves of enemies. Mayor Gret, nursing a minor wound to his arm, moved along the posts trying to maintain order, distributing the last of the water and bandages, organizing the removal of the wounded. During a brief lull following the repelled hybrid attack, Ali frantically tried to recall every detail from his conversations with Gleave. The zombie had mentioned weaknesses of certain mutant types. Zombies were distracted by loud noise. They'd used that. But the hybrids? Gleave had said some, especially those retaining more bestial traits, reacted poorly to loud, sharp sounds and feared fire. Ali gave the order. As hybrids began massing again at the base of the wall, preparing for a new assault, several defenders beat furiously on large sheets of rusted metal salvaged from roofs. The sharp, deafening clang momentarily disoriented some hybrids, causing them to recoil or mill about in confusion. It bought the defenders a few precious seconds. Simultaneously, the last remaining Molotov cocktails were aimed specifically at a group of hybrids described as particularly pyrophobic. Several creatures shrieked and burst into flames, triggering panic among their kin. These were temporary measures, but they helped buy a little more time. In the midst of a renewed hybrid assault, when it seemed another section of the wall was about to fall, one of the defenders, a middle-aged man, the blacksmith whose workshop we saw at dawn, committed an act of desperate self-sacrifice. Seeing several powerful hybrids breach the wall and slaughter his comrades, he, though gravely wounded, reached an unstable section of the wall beneath which a large group of enemies had gathered. With a final effort, he knocked out the props holding the crumbling masonry. Tons of stone and concrete crashed down with a deafening roar, burying dozens of mutants and the blacksmith himself beneath the rubble. This act momentarily halted the enemy's advance in that section and elicited a furious roar from the surviving defenders, boosting their morale. But it also stood as bitter testimony to the bastion's desperate situation. By noon, with the defenders at the absolute limit of their physical and moral endurance, their ranks significantly thinned. Alpha unleashed his elite, the werewolves. These creatures, retaining human intellect and cunning, but possessing monstrous strength, speed, and animalistic fury, appeared on the walls almost simultaneously in several places. They scaled sheer surfaces with incredible ease, their movements swift, precise, and deadly. They didn't charge blindly like the hybrids, but moved with coordination, clearly following Alpha's commands. They breached defenses, directed the attacks of remaining hybrids, and swiftly, efficiently finished off wounded defenders. Their long claws easily tore through makeshift leather armor. Their jaws could snap bone. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new, most perilous phase of the battle. Hope for the bastion's survival began to fade. The appearance of the werewolves on the bastion walls drastically changed the battle's flow. These creatures acted not like mindless killing machines or enraged beasts, but like cold-blooded, trained soldiers from hell. They didn't launch blind assaults like the zombies, nor rely solely on brute force like most hybrids. The werewolves employed tactics. They attacked simultaneously at several seemingly random points along the perimeter, forcing Ali and his depleted squads to constantly shift, stretching the already weakened defenses thin. Their movements were incredibly fast, almost a blur to the weary human eye. Long claws, sharp as razors, on their powerful limbs effortlessly ripped through thick leather jackets and even punctured metal plates. They killed instantly, with a single precise strike or bite, sowing panic and terror among the defenders. The sight of these intelligent yet utterly merciless predators broke the will to resist in many. It became clear the werewolves' attacks weren't random. They purposefully sought out and eliminated those attempting to command the defense in various sectors. Several experienced fighters Ali had appointed as section commanders were killed within minutes of the werewolves' appearance. Their deaths threw the defenders into further disarray. Then, Ali himself became the target. Two werewolves, moving with uncanny synchronicity, attacked him simultaneously from both sides. Ali, drained by hours of combat, reacted instinctively, desperately fending them off with his axe. He managed to block one blow, dodge another, but the claws of one attacker still found their mark, gouging a deep, bleeding furrow across his forearm from elbow nearly to wrist. Pain seared his arm, but adrenaline and fury allowed him to kick one werewolf back and retreat a few steps before the beasts could close the circle. He was wounded but alive, and this drew even more enemy attention. Witnessing the ease with which the werewolves dispatched defenders, their seeming invulnerability, and their savage yet calculated ferocity finally shattered the morale of many in the bastion. Panic began spreading along the walls like a contagion. Some fighters, gripped by terror, dropped their weapons and tried to flee inward, seeking refuge in their homes, though they knew it was futile. Others simply froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to lift a weapon or even move as the monsters approached. Ali, fighting through the pain in his wounded arm, and Mayor Gret, moving from section to section, desperately tried to restore control, shouting orders, calling for courage, but their voices were lost in the chaos and roar of battle. The situation was critical. The walls, which had seemed a reliable defense that morning, now felt like a death trap. In this moment of despair, unexpected help arrived. Gleave, who had evidently been observing the battle from a safe distance, hidden among ruins or rocks, saw that the bastion's defenders were on the verge of complete collapse. Understanding the immense risk, being discovered by other mutants, especially the werewolves who despised his kind and could tear him apart, he decided to act. He couldn't approach closely, but he managed to send Allie a pre-arranged signal. Perhaps it was a brief, bright flash of sunlight reflected from a shard of mirror or polished metal towards the section of wall where he saw Allie. Or perhaps he left some sign, understood only by the two of them, at a pre-agreed spot near the wall's base where Allie might glance. The signal was fleeting, barely perceptible, but Allie, his senses honed to a razor's edge, caught it and understood its meaning. Gleave was pointing toward the main gates. Receiving the signal, or perhaps simultaneously noticing the concentration of elite mutants, werewolves and the largest hybrids, near the main gates, Ali instantly grasped Alpha's plan. All the furious attacks on the walls, the breaches, the tactical maneuvers of the werewolves, it had all been a diversion, designed to exhaust the defenders, stretch their forces thin, and draw attention away from the main thrust. The true target was the gates. To the gates. Everyone. Main gates. Move. Ali yelled, his voice cracking with strain and pain. He ordered all remaining able-bodied defenders to immediately converge on the main gates and prepare to defend the final line. The barricades erected behind them. Only a few remained on the walls to maintain a semblance of resistance there. But the horror wasn't confined to the walls. While the main defensive force was locked in combat on the perimeter, several small, nimble hybrids or unnoticed zombies had managed to slip through breaches and infiltrate the settlement proper. Perhaps they found an overlooked passage through the old, dilapidated sewer system, or simply squeezed through a gap created during the fighting. Soon, screams of terror and the sounds of short, desperate struggles began echoing from the residential quarters further from the walls. Panic now gripped the civilians huddled in their homes. Ali heard those screams, and his heart clenched with helplessness. He was torn between the necessity of defending the gates, the key to the entire settlement's survival, and the urge to rush to the aid of the defenseless people within. He made the hard choice. He sent a small squad of 5 fighters deeper into the settlement, further weakening the already inadequate defense at the gates. It was then that the defenders positioned on the barricades behind the gates and on the fortifications above them saw him. Through the thinning crowd of zombies and hybrids which parted before him, a massive, terrifying figure approached the gates with unnerving confidence. Alpha. He walked unhurriedly, his powerful form radiating an aura of primal strength and authority. He was flanked by the largest, fiercest werewolves of his elite guard. His mere presence had a demoralizing effect on the defenders, paralyzing their will. It was undeniably clear. The battle's decisive moment had arrived. The fate of the bastion hung by a thread, and that thread was anchored at the main gates. The mutants, acting with surprising coordination under Alpha's unseen command, dragged an improvised battering ram toward the bastion's main gates. It was a huge charred log from an old tree found somewhere in the wasteland, or perhaps a heavy section of metal beam from a ruined structure. Dozens of strong hybrids and even some zombies, driven by instinct or the werewolf's will, gripped it, swung it back, and with a guttural roar slammed it against the gates. The first blow shook the entire structure, making the stones above the archway tremble. Defenders on the walls above the gates and behind the barricades inside showered the attackers with the last of their stones and a sparse volley of arrows, but it barely hindered the mutants. Again and again the rams struck the gates. The deafening impact echoed throughout the bastion, drowning out screams and the din of battle. The wooden beams reinforcing the gates from within groaned. The metal began to buckle under the monstrous impacts. Ali and his handful of surviving fighters took positions behind the gates, on the hastily erected barricades, and on the small platform above the gate archway. From here, they did everything possible to stop the enemy. They poured down the last of the boiling water they'd managed to heat on fires inside, scalding and disorienting those trying to approach. They dumped the last drops of flammable oil, trying to make the approach slippery. They threw the final miraculously preserved Molotov cocktails, which flared up at the base of the gates, briefly driving the mutants back. But the odds were overwhelming. The attackers numbered in the hundreds. The defenders in the dozens were exhausted and wounded. The gates yielded more with each blow. Cracks widened. Hinges groaned under the strain. Finally, the breaking point was reached. With a deafening crack that drowned out all other sounds, one of the gate leaves tore from its upper hinge and crashed inward. Into the resulting breach, gaping like a wound in the settlement's body, surged an unstoppable tide of mutants. The fastest, most aggressive hybrids poured in first, followed by a flood of zombies, and leading this wave, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, the werewolves strode into the gap, led by Alpha himself. The last line of defense was broken. A desperate, chaotic battle erupted in the narrow space of the breach, and the small square just beyond, amidst the barricades. Men fought with the fury of the doomed, knowing this was their final stand. Ali was in the thick of it. His axe, an extension of his arm, rose and fell, crushing hybrid skulls, severing zombie limbs, parrying werewolf attacks. Chaos raged around him. Blood, human and mutant, slicked the ground. The cries of the wounded death rattles, the clang of weapons, the furious snarls of mutants, all merged into an unimaginable cacophony. Defenders fell one after another, but the remaining closed ranks, fighting back to back. In the midst of this slaughterhouse, Ali's attention was pulled away for a fraction of a second. His gaze flickered sideways, and he saw what he dreaded most. Several particularly fast, agile hybrids, resembling distorted primates, had managed to break through the main melee at the breach, and were racing deeper into the settlement, down the street that led toward his home. Icy terror seized his heart for an instant. Zara, the children. But he couldn't abandon the fight here, at the gates. That would mean certain death for everyone left. He barely managed to shout to one of the nearby fighters, pointing his axe after the slipping beasts. Stop them. Don't let them get further. But he didn't know if he'd been heard or if anything could be done. That moment of helplessness was worse than any wound. Mayor Gret, fighting alongside the others at the barricade, saw they couldn't hold the breach much longer. Mutants kept pouring in. Their numerical superiority was overwhelming. They had to act immediately before being completely overrun. He signaled several fighters who knew his last desperate plan. Near the gate archway stood the ruins of an old, crumbling building, part of which overhung the passage. During the defense preparations, its unstable supports had been rigged with props that could be quickly knocked out. And rumor had it, the last small homemade explosive charge was hidden there. At Gret's signal, the fighters executed the plan. A short, muffled explosion sounded. The props were kicked away. With a deafening roar, tons of stone, concrete, and debris crashed down directly onto the breach and the square behind it. The collapse buried dozens of mutants who had surged inside and created a new, chaotic, but almost impassable rampart where the gates had been. It was a risky move. Some defenders might have been caught in the collapse, and others possibly trapped outside. But it gave them a chance. In the chaos and dust that rose after the collapse, with some mutants cut off outside the rubble and others buried beneath it, Ali, stunned but intact, struggled to his feet, and saw, standing directly before him amidst the debris, Alpha. The massive werewolf had made it through just before the collapse. Around them, scattered skirmishes continued between surviving defenders and mutants who had broken through, but for a moment, the two leaders stood face to face. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. The final confrontation was inevitable. The duel began without warning. Alpha, letting out a low, menacing growl, lunged at Ali. The disparity in strength was immediately apparent. Alpha was the embodiment of primal power, speed, and bestial fury. He towered over Ali, muscles rippling beneath coarse dark fur, long claws on hands and feet scoring deep grooves in the stones with every move. His blows were devastating. Ali, despite his wound and extreme fatigue, fought desperately, relying on agility, the experience of countless skirmishes, and survival instincts. He dodged sweeping blows from clawed paws, tried to parry with his axe, searched for an opening to strike back. But Alpha was not only strong but incredibly fast and cunning. He anticipated Ali's movements, easily evaded his attacks, and delivered short, tearing strikes of his own, adding fresh cuts to Ali's body and armor. The axe blade merely screeched against the werewolf's tough hide or glanced off bone, inflicting no serious damage. During brief pauses in the furious clash, when the opponents momentarily separated to catch their breath, Ali stared into Alpha's eyes. They blazed with animalistic rage, pupils dilated, yet deep within, behind that feral flame, Ali thought he glimpsed something else. Not a flicker of humanity, no, but a cold, cruel intelligence. Alpha's movements weren't just the chaotic lunges of an enraged beast. There was a terrible logic to them, a calculated tactic of annihilation aimed at exhausting, wounding, and then killing. Alpha snarled, bared his fangs, but his actions were deliberate. The fight couldn't last long. Ali's strength was failing. With one powerful, impossibly fast swipe of his paw, Alpha flung Ali aside. He slammed hard against a pile of rubble from the collapse, hitting his back and head. The air rushed from his lungs, the axe flew from his weakened grasp, skittering several feet away. His vision swam. Alpha slowly, with a palpable sense of superiority, approached and loomed over the fallen man. his massive shadow enveloped Ali. A fanged maw, dripping saliva mixed with blood, opened slowly for the killing bite or a final crushing blow from a clawed paw. Ali saw only inevitable death before him. He instinctively threw up his uninjured arm, trying to shield his face or throat, knowing the gesture was futile. It was at that exact moment that everything changed. His great-grandfather's locket, hanging on its cord over his protective jacket, either snagged and broke free during the impact with the stones or simply slipped out from under the torn fabric, landing on Ali's chest. The metal halves of the locket sprung open upon impact. The old, yellowed yet still clear photograph. A young man in a Marine uniform, close-cropped hair, serious gaze, holding a small boy of about 4 or 5, lay exposed directly beneath the eyes of the looming Alpha. The werewolf froze a split second before delivering the fatal blow. His bestial gaze, previously filled with rage and the anticipation of the kill, suddenly fixed on the small photograph in the locket. The savage snarl ready to erupt from his throat changed into a strange, choked, gurgling sound. His dilated pupils constricted, then widened again. An unseen struggle seemed to unfold within his consciousness. Primal, animal instincts clashed with something else, a sudden, shocking flicker of long-forgotten memory, buried beneath centuries of savagery. Recognition. He stared at the photograph, at the face of the young Marine, at the face of the child, his son, Ali's grandfather. The recognition, whatever its nature, proved too powerful, unbearable for his monstrous form. Alpha let out a deafening, heart-wrenching roar. But it wasn't merely a roar of fury or a battle cry. It held agonizing pain, confusion, shock, perhaps even the bitterness of loss. It was the cry of a being confronted with the impossible, with the ghost of a past he thought forever buried. He recoiled sharply from Ali, as if burned. Without a word to the humans, without even glancing their way again, he issued a different roar, short, guttural, commanding, understood only by his kin. At this signal, the werewolves and hybrids still fighting in various parts of the bastion or trying to claw through the rubble ceased their attacks as if switched off. They froze, then began an organized retreat, back through the breach, over the rubble, scaling the walls. Alpha cast one last, long look, filled with unreadable, complex emotions, at Ali lying on the ground and at the open locket on his chest. Then he spun abruptly and strode with heavy, rapid steps toward the exit from the bastion, leading the remnants of his battered but still formidable army away. The werewolves and hybrids followed him without question. The zombies, deprived of their controlling will, milled about in confusion. Some shambled after the retreating horde. Others simply dispersed into the surroundings or remained, aimlessly wandering near the walls. The siege, which had reached its bloody climax only moments before, ended as suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun. Ali lay on the cold, blood-soaked earth, grievously wounded, exhausted, but alive. He watched Alpha depart, trying to process the unbelievable, what had just happened, and the fact that he was alive, saved by an old photograph in his great-grandfather's locket. A deafening, almost unnatural silence descended upon the ravaged bastion. After the hours-long hell of battle, filled with roars, screams, clanging metal, and thunderous impacts, this silence pressed on the ears, feeling heavy and ominous. It was broken only by the quiet moans of the wounded scattered along the walls and among the ruins near the gate, and the muffled weeping of those beginning to comprehend their losses. The first rays of dawn, filtering through the smoke and dust still hanging in the air, illuminated a horrifying tableau of destruction. The walls were damaged in many places, gaping with breaches. Heaps of corpses, mutilated mutant bodies of every description mixed with the fallen defenders, lay piled at the base of the fortifications and within the settlement. Several buildings near the gate smoldered from fires started by Molotov cocktails or enemy action. The air was thick with the stench of blood, smoke, and pervasive decay. The settlement had held, but the cost of this victory was monstrous. Survivors began emerging slowly from shelters, from behind barricades, descending from the walls. Their faces were smeared with soot and blood, clothes torn, eyes vacant or filled with shock. People searched for family, friends, neighbors, calling out names in trembling voices. The grim work began, tending to the wounded, clearing rubble, extinguishing the last smoldering embers. Mayor Gret, pale, his arm bandaged but kept upright by sheer willpower, gave quiet, firm orders. They needed to collect the bodies of their fallen comrades, separate them from the mutant corpses, aid those who could still be saved. Ali was found by the surviving members of his mobile squad. They carefully lifted him, examined his wounds, applied rough bandages to stop the bleeding. He was conscious but extremely weak from blood loss and shock. His gaze was fixed on the direction the horde had taken, confusion clouding his eyes. With his comrades' help, Ali made it back to his home. The street was littered with debris. Signs of recent fighting were evident. Several corpses of small hybrids lay nearby. His door was barricaded from within but intact. He knocked weakly, a pre-arranged signal. The bolt slid back, and Zara appeared on the threshold. Her face was pale, eyes wide with remembered terror, but she was unharmed. The children, crying with fear but safe, peeked out from behind her. In the corner of the room lay the corpse of another hybrid. Zara had evidently been forced to defend herself and the children with the knife he had left her. Ali stepped inside, and Zara rushed to him, embracing him, feeling for his wounds. Their quiet reunion wasn't filled with joy, but rather with bitter relief and the sharp awareness of how thin the thread of their survival had been. Similar scenes played out across the bastion. Some found loved ones alive, others mourned the dead. Grief mingled with exhaustion and shock. Later, after Ali had rested somewhat, and Zara had cleaned and rebandaged his wounds with clean cloth, Gret came to see him. The mayor looked 10 years older overnight. They sat side by side on the earthen floor, silently watching the dying embers in the hearth. Gret placed a hand on Ali's shoulder. "You saved us, Ali," he said quietly. "Your courage, your leadership. We wouldn't have survived without you." Ali just shook his head. He told the mayor about Alpha's strange, inexplicable behavior at the very end. How the werewolf had frozen before him, then abruptly ordered his horde to withdraw. But he omitted the crucial detail: the locket and the photograph. Something inside him, instinct or a dawning terrible suspicion, warned him not to share it. He had seen the confusion in Alpha's eyes, the reaction to the picture. The idea that the monstrous leader of the mutants could somehow be connected to his family, to his marine great-grandfather, was too wild, too horrifying to put into words. That secret settled heavily upon him. The settlement slowly began to recover. People buried their dead in a small plot of land just inside the inner perimeter. They repaired the walls, cleared the rubble, took stock of the remaining meager supplies of food and water, dividing them equally among the survivors. The victory was bitter. Almost every family had lost someone. Everyone understood this wasn't the end of the war. Alpha was alive. He had retreated, but he wasn't defeated. Now he knew about the bastion, knew about its defenders, knew about Ali. He could return at any time, in a month, a year, perhaps with an even larger army. The war wasn't over. It had merely paused, leaving ruins and fear in its wake. That evening, sitting alone by the window of his dwelling, gazing out at the darkening wasteland, Ali took out the locket again. He looked at the face of his great-grandfather, a young, strong man from a long-lost world. Then he remembered Alpha's eyes as they had stared at that same photograph. An incredible, monstrous possibility began to form in his mind. Could Alpha be? No, it was impossible. But his reaction? Ali clenched the locket in his fist. He had saved his settlement, fulfilled his duty as guardian. But now he faced a new, even more terrifying and personal task. He had to understand who or what Alpha truly was. What drove him? Could he be stopped? And how could he live with the dawning realization that the greatest enemy of his people, the most powerful and brutal creature in the wasteland, might possibly be his own blood, his ancestor, twisted by time and radiation beyond recognition? The story of the bastion would continue, but for Ali, it had taken on a new, dark, and deeply personal dimension. Alpha's shadow loomed not only over the settlement's future, but over his own soul. The battle for survival had only just begun.